Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. The topic of this video is Distant Pathways, Muslims in North America, 16th to 19th centuries. Muslims were a permanent presence in the Americas from the early 16th century, soon after the commencement of European colonization of the region, following Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1493. One of the first Muslims to set foot on the North American continent after the initial Spanish contact was an African, Mustafa Zemuri, who was sold as a slave in 1522 to the Spanish conquistador Andrés Dorantes de Carranza, with whom he eventually traveled as far west as New Mexico. Ironically, perhaps, the first Christian to set eyes on America, Rodrigo da Triana, a member of Columbus's crew, later converted to Islam. Most Muslims who came to the Americas as a consequence of European colonization between the early 16th century and the mid-19th century were brought forcibly. 10,700,000 slaves were captured in West Africa and transported across the Atlantic. It has been calculated that 10 to 20% were Muslim. However, the history of Muslims in North American settlement is by far no means only one of slavery. The period of early Spanish colonization of the Americas followed shortly after the long saga of forced conversion to Christianity of Muslims, termed Moriscos, in the Iberian Peninsula. Many of these freemen made their way to the Americas. From the beginning of the colonial period, both Spain and the Catholic Church perceived Islam as a threat to their religious and cultural hegemony, and sought to resist immigration to the New World to those who were old Catholics, excluding new converts of Morisco backgrounds. However, this was difficult to enforce, as Moriscos were an important component of the skilled workforce of Spain and were needed for much of the opening up of the new territories. Thus, they were present in significant numbers, despite official policies meant to exclude them. In the Americas, few Moriscos rejected their Islamic faith and succeeded to some degree in propagating Islam amongst the indigenous peoples. The 16th century Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros, Grand Inquisitor of Spain, vehemently complained that Islam was being openly practiced in the Americas. Muslim slaves were also brought to the new Spanish colonies from Mediterranean ports, as far east as the Levant. A series of laws was enacted by the Spanish authorities to stop the enslavement of these subjects of powerful regional Muslim rulers, whom they had no desire to provoke, while at the same time blocking a source for the spread of Islam in the New World. There were also many Muslim slaves, mainly Moriscos who had been found guilty of heresy, working the oars of Spanish galleys in the Caribbean. They were also brought from the Philippines, which Spain was then colonizing. The British colonization of North America commenced in the mid-17th century. It also relied on slave labor. A considerable number of British slaves were from Gambia and Senegal and were devout Muslims. Many were well educated, read and wrote Arabic, and were versed in not only the Quran and the Sharia, but in a variety of Islamic sciences. A range of their papers, mainly short religious texts and letters, but including 3 autobiographies, have survived. Although educated Muslim men produced the records which have survived, many female Muslim slaves endured captivity alongside them. A number of British records record the religious devotion of Muslim women slaves. Educated Muslims frequently were able to use their literacy to ameliorate the conditions of their servitude. They learnt colonial business practices and were able to access information restricted to white society. Sometimes they were able even to leverage their freedom. Most slaveholders, nevertheless, perceived the literacy and broad competencies of these educated black Africans as presenting a threat to the colonial fiction of white intellectual dominion. Muhammad Yarrow was an example of a slave who was allowed to undertake paid activities to gain his liberty, Technically enslaved for 44 years, he eventually purchased his freedom and became a respected entrepreneur, bank investor, and homeowner, and was often seen and heard in the streets singing praises to God. Most enslaved Muslims, however, were not so fortunate. The case of Omar ibn Said, 1770 to 1864, is an example. Born in Guinea to a wealthy family, he was an Islamic scholar who spent 25 years of his life studying with prominent Muslim scholars. Captured during a military conflict, he was sent as a slave to North America in 1807. There, he assumed a visible Muslim identity, wearing a white turban as a learned man, and faithfully carrying out all his religious obligations. He possessed a copy of the Quran, apparently given him by generous Christians. He was still a slave at the time of his death in 1864. Such individuals persevered and lived their faith as best they could in unimaginably demoralizing circumstances. Many became pseudo-converts to Christianity to protect themselves and their families while hiding their true beliefs. One freed slave, Lamine Kebe, also an Islamic scholar, pretended to convert to Christianity in order to secure passage back to Africa. An exceptional case was that of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, 1701 to 1773, who openly refused to reject his faith and was rewarded for it. An educated man from a family of Muslim clerics in West Africa, he was enslaved and sent to North America. His faith so impressed his master that he was freed and provided passage back to Africa via England in 1733. There he was accepted as a deeply pious and educated man, mixed with high society and the intellectual elite, and was introduced at the royal court. Advocates of the abolition of slavery frequently cited him as a key figure in asserting the moral rights and humanity of black people. A poignant case of a slave who almost made it back home is that of Abdul Rahman ibn Ibrahim Sori, 1762 to 1829. He was from Timbo, Guinea, where his father ruled the Fouta Djallon Confederation. He studied in Timbuktu and could speak at least 4 different African languages as well as Arabic. While leading an army protecting the coast, he was captured and sent to North America, where he worked for 38 years. A twist of fate occurred when an Irish surgeon, Dr. John Cox, unexpectedly arrived. He was the first European to visit Timbo and, falling ill, was tended for 6 months by Abdul Rahman's family. Cox unsuccessfully offered to buy his freedom. In 1826, a letter in Arabic, which Abdul Rahman wrote to his family in Africa, was forwarded via the US consulate in Morocco and then the Moroccan Sultan. Aware of his plight, the Sultan asked the US president to release him. Sadly, Abdul Rahman died before he could return home. Although their civil status is not clear, a number of African Muslims fought, often with distinction, alongside colonists during the American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783. There was an interest in Islam amongst America's founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, for example, principal author of the US Declaration of Independence and later US President, owned a copy of the Quran, and Islam was a factor in his early writings. However, this did not stop him from continuing to own slaves. Although the importation of slaves into the US was prohibited in 1807, slavery did not formally end well until 1865. The Islam brought to North America by enslaved Africans left traces that are still felt today in some pockets of American Muslim culture. A moving example of the strength of the Islamic faith is the following recollection from 1940, exhibited in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, of Katie Brown, of how her former slave, great-great-grandfather, Bilali Muhammad, and his wife would pray. I quote, "Bilali and his wife, Phoebe, pray on the bead. They was very particular about the time they pray, and they very regular about the hour. When the sun come up, when it's straight overhead, and when it's set, that the time they pray. They bow to the sun and have a little mat to kneel on. The beads is on a long string. Bilali he pull bead and he say, Belambi Hakabara Muhammadu. Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, Muhammad. Phoebe, she say, Amin, Amin. They were very particular about the time they prayed, and they were very regular about the hour. When the sun comes up, when it is straight overhead, and when it sets, that was the time they prayed. They bowed to the sun and had a little mat to kneel on. The beads were on a long string. Bilal pulled a bead and said, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, Muhammad. Phoebe said, Amin, Amin.